Fantastic. All right, let me get this shared and we will get started. Okay, so this was prepared just for you. This is a new presentation, never done before. Yeah, I'll try to show you why it makes very good sense to think that Matan Torah was in fact somewhere in Saudi Arabia. We'll try to be a little bit more specific in a bit. This is not in fact what it looked like, although they did do a good job of getting some old Hebrew letters on the Ten Commandments there. But all right, so what do we know? So we know that Bnei Israel were in Egypt. We don't have pictures actually of Bnei Israel in Egypt, unfortunately. We do have pictures of there being Canaanites in Egypt. Here are some pictures of Canaanites in Egypt. We even have pictures of Canaanites making bricks in Egypt, which is pretty much as close as you're going to get to a picture of Bnei Israel in Egypt. And taskmasters whipping them to make bricks. All sorts of evocative images that we have that give us a sense of what Bnei Israel were actually doing in Egypt. The Egyptians mention Israel, once and only once in all of our recorded Egyptian texts. And that is in this stela, which was found back in 1896 by a very famous and important Egyptologist, actually, named William Flinders Petrie. And it now stands in the Cairo Museum. Although, if any of you have been to the Bible, the Museum of the Bible, in Rabbi Herzfeld's adopted hometown, there is a facsimile, a copy of it in their galleries as well. So you can see how big it is. It's actually quite big. And this is a stela that was put up by the pharaoh Merenptah, or Merneptah, he's often said called in English. This is the son of Ramses the Great, Ramses II. And Merneptah says at the end of his text, there's a long text of all of his accomplishments, primarily about bringing peace to Egypt by driving out the Libyans. And at the end of it, he has this little poem where he says, I'm reading from the left side of the slide here, plundered is Libya, Chati is at peace, carried off is Canaan with every evil, brought away is Ashkelon, taken is Gezer, Yenoam is reduced to non-existence, Israel is laid waste, its seed is no more. Churu has become widowed because of Niland. All lands together are at peace. The word there is Egyptian word, but I'll say in a second, interesting. And everyone who roamed about has been subdued. The reason that it's interesting that peace there is an Egyptian word is that if you look at the top line of this slide, he says that all the rulers are prostrate, saying shalom, salam. And it's there he actually quotes the Semitic word for peace, because all of these kings that he's just conquered are up in Canaan. So they say shalom. You have here on the top, these are the hieroglyphs of how he writes Israel. This is a people of Israel. I'm not going to get into the details now, but it's very clear that it's not a city that's called Israel, but a people, a nation called Israel. Where exactly he met them, there's a lot of ambiguities about this, but here we have, just around the time of Yetziat Mitzrayim, the Egyptians saying that they have vanquished Israel, Israel is no more. Of course, none of this is true. Ashkelon is not destroyed, Gezer is not destroyed. The Egyptians attacked it, but of course, Ashkelon and Gezer continued to exist. Libya and Chati continued to exist, and Israel continued to exist. So again, what exactly he's referring to is an open question, but here's our Egyptian evidence of them meeting Israel at just about the same time that Israel in the Torah talks so much about leaving Egypt. So where are they and where are they going? This is, of course, the heart of the issue for us right now. So we actually know a lot about the geography and topography of Egypt in the time of Ramses II. The reason to look for that time, of course, is that according to the Torah, the Bnei Israel built two cities, one of which is called Ramses. The other one is called Pitom, which we know about as well, but the name is not as transparent as Ramses. So of course, here we have a city called Ramses. As it turns out, Ramses II built a city, which he called Per Ramses. And that is here on the map, if you see it on the slide, It's now called Tel Daba. Ancient city, or Greek name is Avaris. And so that's this dot over here. So, if you think about Egypt, so Egypt, of course, is defined by the Nile River, which goes all the way from down south up to the Nile Delta. This is up in the Delta and to the eastern part of the Delta. It also has to be that Bnei Israel, the whole story of the Exodus, the whole story of Yetziat Mitzrayim takes place in the times of Ramses or one of his descendants, because for most of Egyptian history, the capital was actually far down south, down in Thebes. But if you think about, if you think about the story in the Bible of Moshe throughout the book of Exodus, throughout the stories of Shemot, he's going to the king all the time. He's going to the palace, getting called there, goes in, comes back to Bnei Israel. Bnei Israel, of course, live in Goshen. That's the Delta. And you get the real sense that the king, the capital, and Goshen are really very close to each other. Moshe is able to go back and forth, apparently seamlessly. During Ramses' time, that makes good sense. Ramses built this new capital up in the city that he called Per Ramses, that we call Tel Daba or Avaris. And so in Ramses' time himself, that makes good sense that Moshe would be able to go back and forth between Bnei Israel and the palace very easily. But earlier or later, that actually doesn't make sense, because the palace would have been a couple of 100 miles down south. So in Pi Ramses, that's where Bnei Israel start, that's where they're centered. And we're told in Shemot, Vayisu Bnei Israel me Ramses Sukkota. So they go from the city of Ramses to the city of Sukkot. Again, there's a lot to unpack. Why is it called Sukkot? We'll leave that all aside for now. But you can see, since we know where Sukkot is, it's a city I'll show you in a second, is mentioned a good number of times in Egyptian texts. So that's a 10-hour walk. All right, so that's a 10-hour walk for a good hiker. So maybe it takes a couple of days, but this is a perfectly reasonable 2-day hike for the people to do. What's really amazing is that we have Egyptian texts like this one. So this is the pasuk that we just looked at. On the left side, you have a very bad picture of an Egyptian papyrus, which is a letter, which I'll just read a very quick excerpt from. If you want to read along, it's the second paragraph on the slide. So the Egyptian official is reporting that he's following after 2 slaves. And when I reached the enclosure wall of Cheku, that's Sukkot, on the 3rd month of the 3rd season, they told me that they were saying to the south that the slaves, these escaped slaves, had passed by in the 3rd month of the 3rd season, day 10. I got to the fortress. They said they had gone to Migdol. And if you remember the Psukim in Shemot, that's exactly the route that Bnei Israel are said to have taken. They leave Ramses, they go to Sukkot, then they leave Sukkot, and they camp in front of Migdol. In other words, the geography and topography are exactly what you expect from the Egyptian map. Now, of course, they don't go the way of the land of the Plishtim, right? This is the beginning of Parshat Bishalach, that when they left, when Pharaoh allowed them to leave, God didn't bring them Derech Eretz Plishtim. And this, we've known for a long time, makes very good sense. This is Derech Eretz Plishtim, up the coastal road. They couldn't have gone that way because that is exactly where the Egyptians have a row of forts lining the coastal road. So when the Torah says that God didn't want Bnei Israel to see war, and then they would go back to Mitzrayim, well, of course not. They would literally be going from Egyptian fort to Egyptian fort, Egyptian garrison to Egyptian garrison. That would be a terrible way of escaping Egypt. All right, so instead, I guess we should just stay on this map for a second. Instead, they have to go south. Right, so they can't go the way of the Plishtim, they have to go south. So they're wandering into the what we now call the Sinai Peninsula, which of course, that name is part of our problem here. But they're wandering into the Sinai Peninsula. They're at the Ktsei Hamidbar, at the edge of the wilderness. They cross the Yam Suf, which I won't talk too much about right now, but may well have been an ancient lake that no longer exists. Remember, that's only 6 days after Yetziat Mitzrayim that they get to Yam Suf, so it can't be very far away. Can't be the Gulf of Aqaba, for example, which would take a while to get to. couple of weeks. And then we get a lot of details. And the details, of course, are found a number of times in the Torah. So we have the itinerary that you could piece together in Sefer Shemot. You get it again in Sefer Bamidbar, down in Perek Lamed Gimel. You have again some details in Devarim. And I'm not going to try to do justice to all of these different accounts right now. Just the highlights. They go to Yam Suf, from Yam Suf, to Midbar Shur. There's no water there. They get to a place called Marah, where there's bitter water. Then they get to a place called Elim, where there's fantastic water. Then they get to Midbar Sin, and then to a place called Refidim. Refidim, there is actually a place in the middle of the Sinai Peninsula that still has a very similar name. It may have been ancient Refidim. Yitro then comes to visit, comes from his area, from his land, has a conversation about judicial system, which is not relevant at all today, of course. And then he goes back to his land. And then they leave Refidim and they go to Midbar Sinai. And here's the question of where Midbar Sinai is. So I've put a map up on the slide here that shows a good idea of where it may have been. So Refidim may well be here in Wadi Feran, and then they would have a long journey off around the Gulf of Aqaba to Saudi Arabia. So what we're going to do now, what we're going to turn to now is to ask the question, why would we think that they went over here and not stayed somewhere over here? So that's, of course, the obvious question. And that's what I'm going to try to give some evidence for right now as to why Har Sinai is likely in Saudi Arabia and not actually in the Sinai Peninsula. All right, so the evidence comes from a couple of different angles. One, often in Tanakh, especially in poems that biblical scholars call archaic poems, that may or may not be older than anything else in Tanakh, but they have a particular style. Hashem is said to come from the south. And not just the south, but we get very specific places that Hashem came from. So we get this, for example, in Dvarim Lamed Gimel, the second to last perek in the Torah, where we read, Vayomar, Hashem misinai ba, v'zarach miseir lamo, hofia mehar paran, ve'ata merivavot kodesh. So 4 lines about God coming forth from places, Sinai, Seir, Har Paran, and then from the Rivavot Kodesh, from the holy myriads. From his right, fire is flying at his right side, or something like that. So Sinai is associated with Seir and Har Paran. In Tehillim Samachet, so just sort of file that away for a second. Elohim b'tzeitcha lifnei amecha b'tzadcha b'shimon sela eretz ra'asha av shamayim natfu b'pnei Elohim ze Sinai b'pnei Elohim Elohei Yisrael. So God comes forth, marching out of the wilderness, God of Sinai. So this is obviously what it looked like, and we get a little bit more detail in a very similar pasuk in Shirat Dvorah. Hashem b'tzeitcha miseir. B'tzadcha mistei Edom, Eretz Ra'asha, Gam Shamayim natafu, Gam Avim natfu mayim, Harim nazlu mipnei Hashem ze Sinai, mipnei Hashem Elohei Yisrael. Hashem, when you left Seir, when you marched out of the country or the field of Edom, then the land quaked, the heavens dripped, the clouds dripped water because of Hashem of Sinai. So Sinai in all these psukim is associated with Seir, with Edom, and one more in Habakkuk, Eloah miteman yavo, the Kadosh me Har Paran. Again, Har Paran, Teman's a new one that we haven't seen yet. Har Paran, Kisa Shemayim Hodo Tilato Mala'ar. So God's always marching out of the south. Teman, Har Paran, Seir, Edom, Sinai. These are places that all come together in these poems as the place where God left from on his march. It's never said exactly where he's marching to, I'm sorry. But the impression is that the target eventually is the Beit HaMikdash. Some of these poems are from before the Beit HaMikdash, Shirat Dvorah, for example, obviously Shirat Moshe in Dvarim Lamed Gimel. And some of these Mizmarim and Tehillim may also even be before the Beit HaMikdash. But he's marching to what we call Israel from down south. And again, it's not just south, it's not just the direction, but we get some pretty specific names: Seir, Edom, Sinai, in addition to Har Paran and Teman. Now, before we look at this, I'll just say, I think this is probably known to you, but Seir, of course, is associated with Esav. This is where Esav goes to live. When Yaakov and Esav meet on Yaakov's way back to Eretz Canaan after those decades of being away, when they part at the beginning of Parshat Vayishlach, Esav goes to live in Har Seir, and Yaakov goes back to Canaan. And if you look up Seir in a concordance, you're going to find that all the times that many of the times that Seir shows up in Sefer Bereshit, it's associated with Esav. Esav is living in Seir before he meets Yaakov, after he meets Yaakov. That's Esav's territory. Esav, of course, is not a nation. We have no nation later on called Esav. We have a number of nations that come from Esav. And of course, those genealogies give us a list of the peoples who live in different places as well. But as it turns out, Seir is the area that we later call Midian and Moab, probably southern Moab and Midian. Midian is also associated with Yishmael, which is interesting. So let me first tell you this pasuk, and I'll tell you why it's particularly interesting. So we have this passage in this. Sorry, I should have written, but Shoftim Perek Chet, when Gidon, in the middle of a war, Gidon says, "Listen, I would like you to give me your earrings, all the earrings you've gotten." And then the narrator says, "Ki nizmei zahav lahem yishme'elim heim." So the people of Midian have golden earrings because they were Yishmaelim. So we of course, not living 3,000 years ago, didn't know that Yishmaelim had golden earrings either. But here we learn that Midianim were sort of a subset of Yishmaelim, or a type of Yishmaelim. And of course, Yishmael also, like Esav, in Bereshit, goes off from Canaan always to the east. All of the people who are not part of the covenant, not part of the Brit with Hashem, when they leave the covenantal community, they go to the east. Ishmael goes to the east. Esav goes to the east. Later on, this becomes a real issue when Reuven and Gad say they want to go to the east. Moshe freaks out, apparently, because it's like, well, no, that's where people outside of the covenant go. Now, when we look archaeologically to the east, we find that throughout the area, I'll show you a map first, actually, throughout the area of what we call northern Saudi Arabia, right? The Arabian Peninsula is huge. But northern Saudi Arabia, really northwestern Saudi Arabia, and throughout Jordan and into what's now Israel, we have a particular kind of pottery. This is the kind of pottery. It goes by different names. If you want to Google it, it used to be called Midianite pottery because it was found particularly in the area of Midian. But now we found out that it's more widespread than that. But because the first and most important find was at this site called Kuraya in northwestern Saudi Arabia, it's called Kuraya painted ware, Kuraya pottery. Now, archaeologically, archaeologists are really good at pottery. This is what they specialize in. Archaeologically, this all comes from the 13th, 12th century BC. In other words, just exactly the time of Yetziat Mitzrayim. It's all the pottery that's on the slide in front of you or on this map. All these dots show places where Kuraya painted ware was found. All of it comes from that century and a half or so, right around the time of Yetziat Mitzrayim. It's not Bnei Israel making this pottery, but is pottery that's indicative of that time. Now, you look at this and you notice where the pottery is and where the pottery is not. And you notice that there is no Kuraya painted ware anywhere in Sinai itself. Now, it's not to say that no one was living in Sinai. There's other kinds of pottery there. But the Midianite civilization, that's not in Sinai. So it's a different culture that's in Sinai. Now, that already seems interesting, but it's particularly important because, of course, Midian is not just mentioned later in Tanakh. Midian plays a major role even in Sefer Shemot, in the stories leading up to Yetziat Mitzrayim. And that, of course, is the story of Moshe's early days. Because when Moshe flees from Paro, when Moshe, this is back in Perek Bet, into Perek Gimel. So in Perek Bet, V'yivrach Moshe b'pnei Paro, Vayeshev be'eretz Midyan, Vayeshev ala be'er. He settled in the land of Midyan at the well. And of course, Yitro is called Kohen Midyan here and called Kohen Midyan actually in the Sukkim that I glossed over a few minutes ago as well. When he visits Moshe later on in Perek Yud Chet, he's repeatedly called Kohen Midyan. So if he's Kohen Midyan, Midyan is specifically in the area of Saudi Arabia, does not extend to Sinai. So when Moshe flees Egypt and runs to Midyan, there's no way that he's fleeing here. This is not Midyan. The borders of Midyan culturally, it's not a country at this point, but culturally, that's Saudi Arabia. If you wanted to argue it's up farther north in Jordan, that would be fine, but not in the Sinai Peninsula. There's no Midianite pottery, there's no Midianite civilization in Sinai. Why is it so important for us? Because, of course, after he gets married, beginning of Perek Gimel, Moshe haya ro'eh et tzon yitro chotno, Kohen Midyan, v'inhag et tzon achara midbar, v'yavo el har Elohim choreva. Moshe was shepherding the flocks of Yitro, his father-in-law. Oh no, the last line got cut off here. I'm sorry. The priest of Midyan, and he led the flocks. Achar hamidbar. Rabbi Hertzfeld and I were talking about this phrase, but to or behind or something in the direction of the wilderness of the midbar. And then the key point, which is not here on the slide, unfortunately, in English, but it's there in Hebrew. And he came to the mountain of God, to Chorev. Now, of course, Chorev is another name for Sinai. Why it has two names is, again, another question that I'm going to sidestep here. But it's clear, it's totally explicit later on, that Chorev and Sinai are the same place. The Torah sort of vacillates between calling it Sinai and Chorev. And so here, as Moshe is shepherding his father-in-law's flock somewhere in the area of Midyan, he gets to the site of Chorev, to Har HaElohim. And this is, of course, where the burning bush is, which is why people look for anything that might look like a burning bush in the vicinity of whatever hypothesis they have about Mount Sinai. There's, for example, Jebel Musa, which is down in St. Catherine's Monastery in the Sinai, modern-day Sinai. There's a tree outside that they say is supposed to remind you of the burning bush because it glows when the sun hits it. Of course, everything glows when the sun hits it at the right angle in the Sinai. The sun's gorgeous there. But in any event, I won't belabor that point. But the burning bush ought to be in the same place as Har Sinai. And so Perek Gimel and Shemot is really good evidence for associating the burning bush with Midyan. Midyan, we've already said, has to be in northwestern Saudi Arabia, not in the Sinai Peninsula. And if that's where Har Sinai is, then it's got to be in Saudi Arabia as well. I'll wrap this up with just two last points. This, I wouldn't say is a proof for a couple of reasons, but Paul actually says in his letter to the Galatians, this is Hagar. Now, Hagar stands for Mount Sinai in Arabia and corresponds to the present city of Jerusalem. That's typologically. But Paul also thought that Mount Sinai was in Arabia. He also has not nice things to say about Jerusalem, but that's a different issue. And then the last point on the geography is that Moshe at the beginning of Devarim says that Kadesh Barnea was an 11-day walk from Sinai. And I've seen some things online saying, oh, so that proves that it must have been in the Sinai Peninsula because Kadesh Barnea is too far from Saudi Arabia. Maybe they're thinking about like Riyadh or Mecca or something. But northwestern Saudi Arabia is not very far from Kadesh Barnea. This is actually Kadesh Barnea. This is Ain Kadesh in the southern Negev. You see it right there. And according to Google, it is 195 miles from there to Jebel Harb, which according to Rabbi Hul, is the mountain itself. I am not, I hope Rabbi Hirschfeld forgives me for this. I am not willing to say which mountain is Har Sinai, but I think it's certainly in this mountainous region over here, which includes a number of mountains, until you actually find that burning bush or the remnants of the ground up golden calf or something like that. I don't know how we could be more specific about the mountain, but to Jebel Harb is 195 miles. 195 miles, that's not so much. It's not more than 11-day walk. I think we could do it, and we could do it actually in a lot less than that. Okay, they have a lot of people to deal with. That brings it up to 11 days, but that is a totally reasonable hike in 11 days. And so Kadesh Barnea up here, which is a beautiful oasis, to Mount Sinai is absolutely plausibly an 11-day hike, which that doesn't prove anything, but that certainly allows for Har Sinai to be in this area. Again, the real evidence for this is the association of Har Sinai with Midian, which we find in the story of Moshe, and we find in some of the other later allusions to it. And that, I think, has to be, both archaeologically and sort of narratively, has to be in the area of northwestern Sinai. And with that, I will end my presentation. If anyone wants to say anything, comments, questions, things I